The Vidanian Empire had conquered 47 star systems using a remarkably simple philosophy. If you could break someone's bones with your bare hands, you deserved to rule them. It was a refreshingly straightforward approach to galactic politics that had served them well for 3 centuries, though it did tend to limit their diplomatic vocabulary to variations of surrender or be crushed. Their home world of Kara's Prime stood as a monument to this philosophy, where towering spires of black metal reached toward the stars like the claws of some primordial beast. The architecture itself seemed designed to intimidate, which was rather fitting since intimidation was basically their entire foreign policy. Every surface gleamed with a polished sheen of weapons-grade alloys, and the very air hummed with the kind of aggressive energy that made lesser species check their life insurance policies. The Vidanians themselves were nature's answer to the question, what if evolution decided subtlety was for weaklings? Standing 8 feet tall on average, they possessed naturally armored hides that could deflect small arms fire, bone density that would make a rhinoceros jealous, and muscle mass that suggested their ancestors had arm-wrestled asteroids for fun. Their scaled skin shifted between deep emerald and obsidian black depending on their mood, which was usually some variation of ready to fight something. This had worked out splendidly for them, creating a galactic hierarchy as rigid as their spines and twice as unforgiving. At the top sat the Vidanians, obviously, followed by other worthy warrior races who could at least put up a decent fight before being conquered. Below them came the useful but fragile species who built their technology and managed their economies, and at the very bottom dwelt the decorative races who existed primarily to make the universe more interesting and occasionally serve as entertainment. Humans, according to Vidanian classification, fell somewhere between decorative houseplants and particularly clever pets. This assessment wasn't entirely without merit from a Vidanian perspective. Humans averaged a mere 6 feet in height, possessed skin so fragile it could be damaged by prolonged exposure to their own star, and had bones that could be broken by falls that a Vidanian child would consider a pleasant massage. Their muscle density was laughably low, their natural armor non-existent, and their teeth couldn't even properly tear through raw meat. By every Vidanian metric that mattered, humans were essentially mobile jelly in fancy clothes. Which made Kira Chen's arrival at the Imperial Diplomatic Complex all the more amusing to the locals. She disembarked from her sleek human transport vessel, looking exactly like what Central Casting would order if they needed someone to play harmless academic. At 5'6", she possessed the kind of build that suggested her greatest physical challenge was opening stubborn jaw lids. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the sort of crisp business attire that screamed I solve problems with spreadsheets, not violence. Behind wire-rimmed glasses, her eyes held the patient expression of someone accustomed to explaining things to people who weren't quite getting it. The Vidanian dock workers found this absolutely hilarious. Look at that one, rumbled dock supervisor Grex, his scales shifting to the amused yellow-green that indicated he was having a good time at someone else's expense. I've seen sturdier saplings. One good sneeze and she'd snap in half. His subordinates clustered around for a better view, their massive forms creating shadows that could have eclipsed small moons. They whispered among themselves in voices that sounded like gravel trucks having intimate conversations, occasionally erupting in the kind of laughter that registered on seismic equipment. Kira, for her part, seemed utterly oblivious to the attention. She consulted a small device, oriented herself toward the diplomatic quarter, and began walking with the unhurried pace of someone who had somewhere to be and wasn't particularly worried about getting there. Her luggage, a single, practical case, rolled behind her on wheels that squeaked slightly in the heavy Vidanian atmosphere. Should we warn her about the gravity? Asked Junior Supervisor Thack, though his tone suggested this was more curiosity than concern. Kara's Prime's gravity was approximately 1.3 times Earth standard, enough to make most humans feel like they were wearing lead underwear. Give her time, Grex replied, settling back to watch the show. She'll figure it out when she tries to climb the first set of stairs. But Kira reached the stairs leading to the diplomatic complex and ascended them with the same unhurried pace, showing no signs of strain beyond a slight deepening of her breathing. This was mildly disappointing to the gathered crowd, who had been hoping for something more dramatically entertaining. The Imperial Diplomatic Complex was designed according to the same principles as everything else on Kara's Prime. Intimidate first, function second, comfort never. The lobby soared 6 stories high, its walls decorated with holographic displays showing the greatest Vidanian military victories. The furniture was sized for Vidanian proportions and built from materials that could withstand a direct hit from a plasma cannon, which was actually a practical consideration given how Vidanian diplomatic discussions sometimes concluded. Ambassador Thex Van Korak held caught from behind a desk that could have doubled as a small spacecraft. He was a particularly impressive specimen even by Vidanian standards, with scales that shifted between deep purple and black, and scars that mapped out a career's worth of honorable combat. His current expression suggested he was trying to decide whether to be insulted or amused by the human's arrival. Kira Chen. He read from a holographic display, pronouncing each syllable like he was dissecting something unpleasant. Human diplomat, xenobiologist, cultural attaché. He looked up at the small figure standing before his desk. You're smaller than your file suggested. Holo projection can be misleading, Kira replied with a kind of diplomatic non-answer that had been refined over centuries of interspecies relations. I'm honored to represent humanity in these discussions. Discussions. Thex Van tasted the word like it was something that had gone bad in his refrigerator. Yes, your people mentioned wanting to discuss trade agreements, technological exchanges, cultural programs. His scales shifted toward a more aggressive red. We prefer more direct forms of communication. I'm aware of Vidanian preferences for physical demonstrations of intent, Kira said, consulting her notes. However, humanity believes that intellectual discourse can often achieve more lasting results than purely physical solutions. The silence that followed this statement was the kind that usually preceded either laughter or violence. In the Vidanian worldview, suggesting that thinking could be superior to fighting was roughly equivalent to claiming that water was actually dry. General Vroktar, who had been observing from a side chair built to accommodate his even more impressive bulk, made a sound that might have been amusement. Intellectual discourse, he repeated slowly. Is that what you call it when the weak attempt to convince the strong not to simply take what I call it efficiency? Kira replied without missing a beat. Why waste energy conquering something when you can convince it to cooperate willingly? This actually gave both Vidanians pause. Not because they agreed with the sentiment, but because it was such an alien concept that they needed a moment to process it. In their experience, cooperation was something that happened after conquest, not instead of it. Fascinating, Thex Van said finally. And what makes you think we would be interested in this cooperation? Kira adjusted her glasses slightly. Because for all your military successes, you're facing resource depletion in 17 key sectors. Your population growth is stagnating due to warrior culture limiting reproductive rates among your elite, and your technological advancement has plateaued because you keep conquering your scientists instead of collaborating with them. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Both Vidanian scales had shifted to warning colors, and their postures suggested they were reconsidering their policy of treating humans as harmless curiosities. You seem remarkably well-informed for a decorative species, General Vroktar said quietly. We do our homework, Kira replied with the same matter-of-fact tone she might use to discuss the weather. It's a human trait. We tend to study things rather than simply hitting them until they stop moving. What followed was a kind of diplomatic dance that would have been fascinating to xenosociologists and utterly baffling to anyone with common sense. For 3 hours, Kira presented carefully researched proposals for mutual benefit, technological exchanges, and resource-sharing agreements. The Vidanians listened with the polite attention of predators humoring prey, occasionally asking questions that were clearly designed to test whether this small human would break under pressure. She didn't break. If anything, she seemed to find their intimidation tactics mildly interesting from an anthropological perspective, occasionally taking notes that probably wasn't helping their wounded pride. By the end of the session, Ambassador Thex Van had developed the kind of headache that usually required either strong medication or moderate violence to resolve. These proposals will require considerable review, he said finally. Of course, Kira agreed. Complex problems rarely have simple solutions. Indeed. Thex Van's scales had settled into a frustrated orange. Perhaps you would be interested in observing some of our cultural practices while we consider your suggestions? Tomorrow is the Festival of Strength, featuring competitions in our grand arena. The invitation was delivered with the tone of someone offering a child a chance to watch the adults play with dangerous toys. Kira consulted her schedule with the seriousness of someone who actually kept a schedule. That sounds educational, she said. I'd be honored to attend. The grand arena of Kara's Prime was a kind of structure that made engineers weep with a mixture of admiration and horror. It could hold 300,000 spectators. Its walls were reinforced to contain weapons that could level city blocks, and its central fighting pit was large enough to stage naval battles if someone had been so inclined. The architecture was less designed than carved from a mountain and dared to collapse, which was very much in keeping with Vidanian aesthetic preferences. The Festival of Strength was their most sacred celebration, a 3-day tournament where warriors from across the empire competed for the honor of challenging the current champion. It was part sporting event, part religious ceremony, and part excuse for the kind of violence that made other species reconsider their galactic insurance policies. Kira had been seated in what the Vidanians probably considered the place of honor, though it was really more like a zoo exhibit. She was surrounded by other distinguished guests from non-warrior species, all of whom seemed to share the common characteristic of looking like they'd rather be literally anywhere else in the galaxy. The current match featured 2 Vidanian warriors attempting to beat each other unconscious with weapons that looked like someone had crossbred clubs with plasma cannons. It was the kind of spectacle that was either deeply impressive or deeply disturbing, depending on your cultural background and tolerance for recreational violence. Magnificent, isn't it? Asked Trade Minister Hexen, who had joined the diplomatic party to ensure their guests properly appreciated Vidanian culture. See how Warrior Grakton uses his natural armor to deflect Vordash's strikes while positioning for a counterblow? Pure artistry. Kira watched the proceedings with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. It's certainly energetic, she agreed. Though I noticed they are both favoring their right sides, suggesting previous injuries that weren't allowed to heal properly. Warrior Grakton has a slight delay in his left leg responses, probably from damaged nerve pathways, and Vordash's breathing patterns indicate reduced lung capacity from old chest trauma. Trade Minister Hexen stared at her. You can see all that. Biomechanics is a hobby of mine, Kira replied, still watching the fight. Every species has tells when they are operating with physical limitations. Vidanians are actually quite easy to read once you understand the relationship between scale coloration and cardiovascular stress. This casual demonstration of analytical skill was beginning to make several Vidanians uncomfortable. They were accustomed to being the ones who studied their enemies for weaknesses, not the other way around. The match concluded when Grakton managed to land a blow that sent Vordash flying into the arena wall with enough force to crack the reinforced stone. The crowd erupted in cheers that could probably be heard from orbit, and Grakton raised his weapon in triumph, his scales blazing with the golden color of victory. Impressive, Kira noted, though is definitely going to need medical attention for that shoulder. The angle of impact indicates torn connective tissue. He is a warrior, Trade Minister Hexen said stiffly. Warriors do not require medical attention for minor injuries. Of course not, Kira agreed diplomatically. I'm sure he'll be fine until the joint completely deteriorates in 6 to 8 years. Before Hexen could respond to this cheerful prediction of doom, the arena's atmosphere shifted. The crowd's cheers faded to an expectant murmur, and the lighting dimmed to focus on the champion's entrance. Zarkhan the Unconquered entered the arena like a natural disaster wearing armor. He stood nearly 10 feet tall, which was impressive even by Vidanian standards, and his scales were the deep black of someone who had never known defeat. His combat record was the stuff of legend, 847 victories, 0 defeats, 312 confirmed kills, and a reputation that made other warriors reconsider their career choices. He didn't walk so much as flow across the arena floor, each movement demonstrating the kind of physical control that came from a lifetime of turning violence into an art form. His weapon of choice was a massive blade that hummed with contained energy, and his armor was crafted from the scales of enemies who had been foolish enough to challenge him. Zarkhan the Unconquered, Trade Minister Hexen announced with obvious pride. Champion of champions, apex predator of the arena, undefeated for 47 consecutive seasons. Kira watched the champion with the same clinical interest she'd shown the previous fighters. 47 seasons, she repeated thoughtfully. That's quite a run. What's his longest single combat? 3 hours and 17 minutes against the former champion, Hexen replied. It was considered one of the greatest battles in arena history. Kira made a note in her ever-present notepad. Interesting endurance levels for someone his size. Though I notice he favors intimidation over immediate attack. Psychological warfare before physical engagement. It is the mark of a true warrior, Hexen agreed, though he was beginning to sound less enthusiastic about Kira's running commentary. He understands that victory begins in the mind. Absolutely, Kira said. Fear can be as effective as any weapon, though it does require your opponent to be susceptible to intimidation. The opening ceremony continued with the pomp and circumstance that Vidanians brought to all their sacred rituals. There were speeches about honor and strength, demonstrations of traditional weapons, and ceremonial challenges that nobody was actually expected to accept. The crowd worked itself into the kind of frenzy usually reserved for natural disasters or really good sales. Finally, Zarkan took his position in the center of the arena, his blade gleaming under the spotlights. The challenger, a young warrior named Tekva who had fought his way through 3 days of preliminary rounds, entered from the opposite side with the kind of confidence that suggested he hadn't fully grasped what he was getting into. The fight lasted exactly 43 seconds. Tekva opened with a series of aggressive strikes that would have overwhelmed most opponents. Against Zarkan, they might as well have been love taps. The champion deflected each attack with minimal effort, then responded with a counter-assault that redefined the local understanding of kinetic energy. The final blow sent Tekva skidding across the arena floor to land in an unconscious heap 20 feet away. The crowd's roar of approval could probably be measured on the Richter scale. Magnificent. Trade Minister Hexen declared. Did you see the precision of that final strike? Perfect application of force and leverage. Yes, Kira agreed. Though he telegraphed it rather obviously. The shoulder rotation started a full second before the actual swing. Against a more observant opponent, that could be exploited. Hexen's scales shifted toward an irritated red. You speak as though you could do better. Oh, I couldn't match him for raw power, Kira said matter-of-factly. But power isn't everything in combat. Physics, leverage, anatomy, timing, there are other factors to consider. Such as? Well, for instance, Vidanian physiology has several structural weaknesses that could be exploited by someone who understood them. Your natural armor is impressive, but it's also rigid, creating stress points at the joints. Your center of gravity is high due to your upper body mass distribution, making you vulnerable to properly applied leverage. And your cardiovascular system, while robust, has predictable patterns that could be disrupted with precise pressure point application. The trade minister stared at her with the expression of someone who had just heard a Goebel explain quantum physics. You have studied Vidanian anatomy. Xenobiology is my specialty, Kira replied. I find it fascinating how different species have evolved different solutions to the same basic problems of survival and combat. Before Hexen could formulate a response to this disturbing revelation, something went wrong in the arena. Zarkan had been acknowledging the crowd's adulation when his posture suddenly changed. His scales, which had been the satisfied gold of victory, shifted rapidly through red and orange before settling on a violent purple that indicated extreme aggression. His movements became jerky, erratic, and his weapon began weaving patterns in the air that suggested he was seeing enemies that weren't there. What's happening? Someone in the diplomatic section asked. Combat stim malfunction, Kira said quietly, her analytical tone sharpening into something more focused. Someone drugged him with military-grade aggression enhancers, but the dosage is wrong. He's experiencing a psychotic break. This assessment proved accurate when Zarkan suddenly roared a challenge that shattered several windows and launched himself at the arena wall. His blade carved through the reinforced barrier like it was made of paper, and he began climbing toward the spectator sections with the single-minded determination of someone who no longer recognized the difference between gladiatorial combat and actual warfare. Panic erupted in the stands. 300,000 Vidanians, each capable of bench-pressing a small vehicle, began trying to evacuate simultaneously. The result was the kind of chaos that made riot control specialists weep and update their resumes. Arena security moved to intercept Zarkan, but they might as well have been trying to stop a volcanic eruption with stern words and good intentions. The champion carved through their ranks like a force of nature, his drugged mind interpreting every attempt to subdue him as a personal challenge that required immediate and violent response. In the diplomatic section, Trade Minister Hexen was shouting into a communication device while simultaneously trying to organize an evacuation. All security to Arena Level 7. We need heavy weapons teams and neural disruptors. Move, move, move. Neural disruptors won't work, Kira said conversationally. Military-grade stims include resistance to most non-lethal suppression methods. You'd need something that could penetrate his natural armor and deliver enough voltage to disrupt his entire nervous system. Then what do you suggest? Hexen demanded. Kira considered the question with the same thoughtful expression she'd used to analyze trade proposals. Physical intervention targeting structural weak points. but it would require precise timing and anatomical knowledge. Our best warriors are already engaging him. Yes, and they are failing because they are fighting him like he's a normal opponent. But he's not thinking rationally anymore. His responses are purely instinctual, which makes them predictable. As if to illustrate her point, Zakan burst through another security barricade and began advancing on a section filled with civilians. His blade carved through everything in his path, and his roars had taken on the kind of primal quality that suggested higher brain functions had left the building. Someone needs to do something, Trade Minister Hexen said desperately. Yes, Kira agreed. She stood up, set down her notepad, and removed her glasses. Someone does. What happened next would be analyzed by military strategists for decades and completely rewrite several species' understanding of human capabilities. Kira vaulted over the barrier separating the diplomatic section from the arena floor. She landed with a controlled roll that absorbed the impact and came up running toward the drug champion. Her movements had shed the careful restraint of diplomatic protocol and revealed something else entirely, the fluid precision of someone who understood violence as both art and science. Zakan noticed her approach and turned with a kind of predatory focus that had made him arena champion. His blade swept around in an arc that should have bisected her at the waist. Kira wasn't there anymore. She had dropped into a slide that carried her beneath his swing, simultaneously striking upward at a point just behind his left knee. The blow looked almost casual, but it targeted the precise junction where Vidanian armor plating created a stress concentration point. The impact disrupted his stance just enough to shift his center of gravity. Zakan stumbled, his drug-enhanced reflexes trying to compensate for the unexpected imbalance. But Kira was already moving, her hands finding purchase points on his armor that she used to redirect his momentum rather than oppose it. Basic physics took over. 10 feet of unbalanced predator met the immovable force of properly applied leverage. The champion of champions went down like a building undergoing controlled demolition. Kira followed him to the ground, her movements flowing from the takedown into a precise nerve strike that targeted the cluster of neural pathways at the base of the Vidanian skull. It was the kind of technique that required exact knowledge of alien anatomy and perfect timing. Zakan, the unconquered, apex predator of the arena, went limp. The entire sequence had taken less than 6 seconds. Silence fell over the arena like a physical weight. 300,000 Vidanians stared at the small human woman standing over their greatest warrior, trying to process what they had just witnessed. It was the kind of cognitive dissonance that made reality seem negotiable. Kira straightened, brushed dust from her jacket, and put her glasses back on. He'll be fine once the drugs work their way out of his system, she announced to the stunned crowd. Though someone should probably check his supplier. That was either a deliberate overdose or criminal incompetence. Trade Minister Hexen made his way down to the arena floor on unsteady legs. How? He asked weakly. How did you do that? Leverage, timing, and anatomy, Kira replied, retrieving her notepad from where she'd left it. Plus a reasonable understanding of physics. Vidanians are impressive opponents, but you're not magic. You have the same structural limitations as any biological organism. But you're so small. Size is only one factor in combat effectiveness, Kira said patiently. Intelligence, training, and proper technique can often overcome raw physical advantages. It's basic military science. General Vroktar, who had witnessed the entire incident from the command level, descended to join them. His scales were shifting through colors that suggested his worldview was undergoing rapid reconstruction. You were military, he said. It wasn't a question. Former Marine Corps, Special Operations, Kira confirmed. Before I went into diplomacy, we're trained to analyze and neutralize threats regardless of their physical specifications. All humans receive this training. Oh, no. Just the ones who volunteer for it. Though basic self-defense and tactical thinking are fairly common in human education, we tend to be suspicious of the idea that physical strength automatically equals superiority. Ambassador Thexvan arrived with a security detail that was looking somewhat redundant at this point. He surveyed the scene, his unconscious champion, the unharmed human diplomat, and the crowd of witnesses who were still trying to reconcile what they'd seen with everything they thought they knew about the universe. This changes things, he said finally. Does it? Kira asked. Because from my perspective, nothing has changed. I'm still here to discuss mutually beneficial cooperation between our species. The only difference is that now you might be more inclined to listen to what humanity has to offer. And what exactly does humanity have to offer? Kira smiled, and for the first time since our arrival, it wasn't entirely diplomatic. Intelligence, creativity, and the kind of problem-solving skills that can find solutions other than hit it until it stops moving. We've learned that the universe is full of challenges that can't be conquered through brute force alone. Such as resource depletion, technological stagnation, social stratification leading to population decline. She consulted her notes. All problems that affect the Vidanian Empire, and all problems that human collaboration could help address. If you're interested in solutions, rather than just demonstrations of strength. General Vroktar looked down at the still unconscious Zarkon. How long will he remain incapacitated? Probably another 20 minutes. The nerve disruption was temporary, just enough to override the drug-induced aggression and allow his system to regain equilibrium. You could have killed him. Yes, Kira agreed simply, but that would have been counterproductive to diplomatic relations. Besides, he's not really the enemy here, just someone who was drugged and lost control. The real question is who had access to military-grade combat stimulants, and why they wanted to disrupt the festival. This observation sent a chill through the gathered Vidanians that had nothing to do with the arena's air conditioning. Political assassination attempts were one thing, but using their greatest champion as an unwitting weapon suggested enemies with both resources and detailed knowledge of Vidanian culture. We will investigate, Ambassador Thexvan said grimly. Good, Kira replied. And while you're investigating, perhaps we could continue our discussions about cooperation agreements. I believe humanity's analytical capabilities might be useful in identifying whoever orchestrated this incident. The negotiations that followed were conducted in a considerably different atmosphere than the previous day's session. Gone was the condescending amusement and barely concealed dismissal. In its place was the kind of respectful attention usually reserved for equals or dangerous unknowns. Kira's proposals were examined with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. Her suggestions for technological exchange were discussed as potential solutions rather than amusing curiosities. And when she outlined humanity's approach to conflict resolution through intelligence gathering and strategic planning, the Vidanians listened with the attention of people who had just learned that their assumptions about the universe might need updating. You fight with your minds, General Vroktar observed during a break in the formal proceedings. Among other things, Kira agreed. Physical capability is important, but it's only one tool in the arsenal. Humans have learned to be creative about problem solving because we had to be. We're not the strongest or the fastest or the most naturally armored species in the galaxy, but we might be the most adaptable. Adaptable, the general repeated thoughtfully. Yes, I can see how that would be valuable. It has its uses, Kira said modestly. For instance, adaptability allows us to work with species whose capabilities complement our own rather than simply competing with them. The Vidanian Empire has impressive physical and military resources. Humanity has analytical and technological capabilities that could enhance those resources significantly. A partnership of strengths rather than a hierarchy of dominance, Ambassador Thexvan mused. Exactly. Though I understand that might be a difficult concept for a culture built around conquest. Perhaps, Thexvan admitted. But today's events have been educational. 3 hours later, the preliminary framework for the first Human-Vidanian Cooperation Treaty was taking shape. It included provisions for technological exchange, joint research initiatives, and cultural programs designed to increase understanding between the species. More importantly, it was structured as an alliance between equals rather than a submission agreement. As the session concluded, Trade Minister Hexen approached Kira with the careful respect of someone who had learned not to judge books by their covers. I owe you an apology, he said formally. We underestimated your species based on superficial characteristics. It's a common mistake, Kira replied graciously. Humans do it too, sometimes. The key is being willing to revise your assumptions when new information becomes available. Indeed. Hexen's scales had settled into a thoughtful blue-green. Tell me, how many humans possess your particular combination of diplomatic and combat skills? More than you might expect, Kira said with a slight smile. Though we generally prefer to lead with diplomacy. Violence is a last resort, not a first option. A wise policy, General Vroktar interjected, joining the conversation. Though your demonstration today has raised interesting questions about human military capabilities. I'm sure our military attaches would be happy to discuss those topics once formal relations are established, Kira replied diplomatically. Though I should mention that what you saw today was fairly basic by human standards. We've had a lot of practice dealing with larger, stronger opponents. This casual revelation that her impressive display had been considered basic was probably not helping Vidanian self-esteem, but it was certainly encouraging their interest in human partnership. As the diplomatic party prepared to depart, Ambassador Thexvan made one final observation. Your species has given us much to consider, Diplomat Chen. We approach these negotiations expecting to deal with a minor species seeking our protection. Instead, we find ourselves facing potential partners who might teach us new ways of understanding strength itself. Strength comes in many forms, Kira agreed. Physical power is important, but intellectual strength, cultural adaptability, and strategic thinking are equally valuable. The galaxy is a complex place. It takes all kinds of capabilities to thrive in it. Yes, Thexvan said slowly. I believe it does. 2 days later, news of the preliminary treaty began spreading through Vidanian space and beyond. The official reports focused on the potential for technological and economic cooperation between the Empire and humanity. The unofficial reports, spreading through military channels and warrior guilds, told a different story, one about a small human diplomat who had casually disabled their greatest champion and then gone back to discussing trade agreements as if nothing had happened. The galaxy's understanding of humanity began to shift in subtle but significant ways. Species that had dismissed humans as irrelevant started paying attention to their expanding influence. Military strategists began revising their assessments of human capabilities. And diplomatic corps across known space started wondering what other surprises the galaxy's weakest species might have in store. Kira Chen, for her part, returned to her ship with a signed cooperation framework and a collection of notes for her xenobiology research. She had accomplished her mission objectives, advanced human interests in this sector, and provided a valuable lesson about the dangers of judging entire species based on superficial characteristics. She also made a personal note to recommend that future human diplomats receive updated briefings on Vidanian combat stimulants and their side effects. Professional thoroughness, after all, was just another form of strength, and in a galaxy full of assumptions about what strength meant, thoroughness was proving to be humanity's most valuable asset. The universe, it seemed, was full of surprises for those wise enough to look beyond the surface. And sometimes, the greatest strength came in packages that nobody expected.